So welcome to the Scopes Monkey Trial, Then and Now. My name's Linda Halpern. As a member of the Social Science Curriculum Committee, it is my pleasure to introduce our instructor today, Doug Mishkin. In the interest of full disclosure, I have to tell you that Doug helped me out a great deal by writing his own introduction, which is better than anything I could have said. Doug Mishkin is a poverty and civil rights lawyer here in Western Massachusetts. Previously, he practiced law for 37 years in Washington, D.C., but he's asked me to emphasize the poverty and civil rights lawyer angle because that sounds better. For any OLLI course, you should always ask, how is this teacher qualified to teach this course? Today, the question is, what qualifies Doug Mishkin to teach about the Scopes Monkey Trial? Doug says that's a good question, and he's been wondering about that himself. So for now, he suggests a practical approach. You're here, he's here, so let's give it a shot. And I'm happy to introduce Doug.
Oh. If today you can take a thing like evolution and make it a crime to teach it in the public school, tomorrow you can make it in the private schools, and the next year you can make it a crime to teach it in the hustings or in the church. At the next session you may ban books and the newspapers. Soon you may set Catholic against Protestant and Protestant against Protestant and try to foist your own religion upon the minds of men. If you can do one, you can do the others. Ignorance and fanaticism is ever feeding, ever busy and needs feeding. Always it is feeding and gloating for more. After a while, Your Honor, it is the setting of man against man and creed against creed, until with flying banners and beating drums, we are marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century, when bigots burned the men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind. If that speech sounds familiar to some of you, or if it sounded familiar when I read it at the recent OLLI open house, you're thinking you heard it when you saw the movie Inherit the Wind. And yes, words very similar to that speech appear in Inherit the Wind, except what I just read to you are not the words of two playwrights or a screenwriter spoken by an actor long before those words were uttered in a movie. They were the real words of a real lawyer in a real trial that occurred in July 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. Good morning. I am Doug Mishkin. I am delighted to be here with you. I'm particularly delighted to be participating with OLLI, and I am selfishly thrilled that you're joining me to explore one of my passions. God bless the Berkshires. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I was home from school for a week, sick. Each day, I watched the 1 o'clock movie, the same movie each day. Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy, Frederick March, and Gene Kelly. I was hooked. Sadly, I already had a notion that I was heading to law school. And I distinctly remember thinking, this is terrible. I'm going to law school, and they've already tried the most fascinating case imaginable. What I didn't figure on was that 90 plus years later, after that trial, we would still be fighting about and litigating these issues. So I call the course the Scopes Monkey Trial Then and Now. But you should ask, so what? Why should anyone care about the trial? Because the trial was interesting and important. The trial itself was fascinating. It was dramatic. It was entertaining. But the popular impression of the trial has been shaped almost entirely by the movie Inherit the Wind. In Lecture 5, we're going to take an in-depth look at the play and the movie to try to understand how it became an American cultural phenomenon. But the actual trial was so much more interesting. The real trial is a great story. It's a series of great stories. If you're going to hear the phrase Scopes Monkey Trial, if you're going to use the phrase, I say you might as well know what actually happened. The trial was more than interesting, it was important. The litigants fought about religion, education, free speech, science, and the relationship among all of them. In other words, they were fighting about some of the great issues of our time. In the final lecture, I'll talk about how some Supreme Court and other cases are actually descendants, if you will, in one way or another, of the Scopes trial. In the second, third, and fourth lectures, I'm going to take us through the trial in detail, exploring some of the well-known excerpts and some trial moments that you would have no way of knowing about. I'm going to do that to help us understand how the Scopes battles led to what we hear and see today. But I'm going to do all of that for another reason as well, so let me confess it to you right up front. I'm going to do it because it's fun. Some trials feature a smoking gun or forensic evidence or important images of a crime scene or documents that comprise a disputed transaction. The currency of the Scopes trial was language. Some of it was soaring oratory. And I'm going to share large portions of it with you, even when it means reading a fair amount of then he said, then he said, then he said. Because I want to take you inside the courtroom so you can begin to feel the presence of these larger-than-life characters. There is no video or audio recording of the trial, but there is a transcript and, of course, much written about it. So I will rely on the transcript as well as memoirs of people like Darrow and Bryan and some of the other lawyers, and especially John T. Scopes. There are also terrific secondary materials that I'll mention. I've referenced them on the OLLI website. You have a hard copy of that list. Let me say another brief word about myself. I am a lawyer. I practiced in Washington for many years until this past October when I transitioned to my home here in Egremont to become a poverty and civil rights lawyer. I'm doing this to heighten the chance that somebody will say something nice about me at my funeral. But more to the point for this course, I am fascinated by and passionate about the issues that flow from the separation of church and state. I do pro bono legal work for Americans United for Separation of Church and State, an outstanding organization with a marvelous executive director and a superb legal staff. Here in Massachusetts, I was the lead lawyer in the case of Kaplan versus Town of Acton, in which the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court it prevented a Community Preservation Act grant that the town of Acton wanted to give to a local church because, as we argued, that grant violated the Anti-Aid Amendment of the Massachusetts State Constitution, which expressly prohibits the use of public funds to aid or maintain a church. Now, since my mention of that case frequently prompts questions, let me hasten to add, I'll be happy to engage in dialogue about the case, but let me also add, I don't want to take up class time to do it, at least not until the last class, when we talk about cases after Scopes. But at the least, I'd like you to know at the outset, I have a deeply held conviction about these issues. It's a conviction that may be more to the liking of some of you than others. For this course, I trust it won't matter. Let me be clear about what this course is not. This course is not an intellectual or social history of religious fundamentalism in the late 19th and early 20th century America, or is it a history of education during that period? You want an intellectual, sign up for Kate Kidd, okay? But nor is this a course in evolution or Darwin or how natural selection works. My objectives for this course, like my capabilities, are more modest. I propose to tell you the story of the trial in more detail than you've heard before to help you better appreciate its impact then and now. So let me begin by observing The Scopes monkey trial is a triple misnomer. It was not about Scopes, it was not about monkeys, and it wasn't really a trial. What do I mean? Well, it wasn't really about Scopes. We're going to talk about him shortly. But as you'll hear, if it hadn't been Scopes, it almost surely would have been someone else. And he almost surely did not teach evolution. And he said nothing during the trial until after the jury rendered its verdict. It certainly was not about monkeys. Darwinian theory does not have human beings descending from monkeys or apes. It's not even accurate to say the trial was about evolution. Evolutionary theory concerns all species. The fundamentalists, represented by the state of Tennessee, were concerned only with one aspect of Darwin, his approach to human evolution. Lastly, it wasn't really a trial. Yes, it was in a courthouse, there was a judge and a jury, and there were lawyers arguing for each side, but trials are about factual disputes. Legal issues get resolved by judges. Did Scopes dispute that he taught what he was alleged to have taught? No. Although, as you'll see, it almost surely was not true that he taught it. He didn't actually teach what he was accused of teaching, but the defense did not want that to be the issue. It didn't want to win that way. And the prosecution needed Scopes to have taught as alleged because it needed a defendant. Most of the courtroom time was spent with lawyers arguing legal points and making other kinds of speeches. The jury, which thought they had a ringside seat to a great spectacle, was hardly in the courtroom. It was 1925. The World War I had ended 7 years earlier. Calvin Coolidge had been elected president the year before. That summer, the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Washington Senators were on their way to meet in the World Series in the fall. Pirates in 7. Those born that year included Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Margaret Thatcher, Johnny Carson, Idi Amin, Barbara Bush, Sammy Davis Jr., Elaine Stritch, Medgar Evers, Yogi Berra, and, personal favorite, Dick Van Dyke. And Christian fundamentalism was on the rise. Now, for a detailed social and intellectual history of what set the stage for 1925 in Dayton, I commend to you the first of 2 books that I'll mention by Edward J. Larson. Larson's first book in 1985, entitled Trial and Error, The American Controversy Over Creation and Evolution. In a few brief sentences, he tells us that before Darwin, American scientists typically accepted the biblically orthodox view that God directly created every type of species. So leading scientists like Harvard zoologist Louis Agassiz wrote that the truth of the biblical story of creation was, quote, confirmed by the revelations of science, which unequivocally indicate the direct interventions of creative power. Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859. Larson says the first generation of American scientists trained after the publication of Origin of Species began writing high school textbooks in the 1880s, and they were evolutionary. Hunter's A Civic Biology, a text about which we will hear much more, was the most widely used high school biology textbook at the beginning of the anti-evolution movement. High schools were teaching this stuff before the anti-evolution movement. So what kept the anti-evolutionists? Larson notes several possibilities. One is that it was the general expansion of public education that provoked the anti-crowd. Another factor may have been what he calls the passing of the evangelical evolutionists, those who reconciled religious orthodoxy with evolution. In a terrific book, Ray Ginger's book, 6 Days or Forever, Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, the author, Ray Ginger, says, Like so much evil, the Scopes trial began with a sincere effort to do good. So it was on January 21st, 1925, that John Washington Butler introduced the Butler Act in the General Assembly of Tennessee. Who was John Washington Butler? We're told he was from a long-time corn and tobacco farming family in Macon County, north central Tennessee. County didn't have a single mile of railroad track. Butler taught school for 5 years. He taught in the fall, raised his crops in the spring on the family farm. So the story is that Butler heard about a visiting preacher who described a young woman in his Tennessee community who enrolled in a biology course at a nearby university. And the preacher said afterwards that she was no longer a Christian because evolution had destroyed her faith in God. Butler asked himself whether evolution could turn one of his own 3 boys into an atheist. Could this happen to his neighbor's children? Never mind the universities, evolution was being taught in Macon County's high schools. He was worried. You bring your children up to be God-fearing, and the biology teacher undoes their faith. To Butler, this was replacing rural values with urban values that didn't respect religion. So in 1922, he's elected to the State House by promising to protect school children from the effects of this godless doctrine of evolution. It's interesting. We're told that unlike most opponents of evolution, he was not an evangelist. Right? He was a member of a small sect called the Primitive Baptists. They were actually anti-evangelistic. Their view was that God has chosen who will be saved and nothing can be done to change God's mind. They frowned on revival meetings and missionary work and even Sunday schools, in contrast to the more popular missionary Baptist beliefs. So Butler's bill passes the House 7 days after he introduces it. Overwhelming vote, 71-5. You might ask, what was said at the public hearings that the legislature held as part of its careful consideration of this bill? Don't be silly. There were no public hearings. When one legislator asked for debate, Butler said, "I don't see the need for any further talk. Everybody knows what evolution means." But there was, in fact, a public to-do. The press got on the case. The Tennessee Senate committee, in fact, voted down the bill. End of story? Not so fast. Of course, that's not the end of the story. The anti-evolutionists responded. The fundamentalist evangelist Billy Sunday preached in Memphis. He said, "Education today is chained to the devil's throne." And he congratulated the Tennessee House for having the courage to take action against the God-forsaken gang of evolutionary cutthroats. The tide turned in favor of Butler's bill. March 13th, the Senate approves it, 24-6. It rejected the arguments of one of the Republican legislators who blamed the whole controversy on that greatest of all disturbers of the political and public life from the last 28 or 30 years, and I mean William Jennings Bryan. The governor of Tennessee, Austin Peay, he was a progressive. And the year before, he had defeated a lawyer named John Neal for the governorship. You'll hear that name again. Some people hoped that Governor Peay was actually going to veto the bill. No such luck. When Governor Peay signed the Butler Act into effect on March 21st, he assured the world, probably the law will never be applied. It may not be sufficiently definite to permit of any specific application or enforcement. Nobody believes that it's going to be an active statute. The newspaper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, wrote with prescience of those who enacted it, "Their pot shot at science will prove a boomerang." The law had a penalty of a monetary fine, no jail sentence. William Jennings Bryan himself wrote to a Tennessee state senator urging that there be no penalty at all. He said, "That'll be a distraction. Just make it like a resolution." The fine stayed. Here's the text of the Butler Act that was enacted into law. that it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities or normals, teachers' colleges, and all other public schools which are supported by state funds, it's unlawful to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Now it starts to get fun. On May 4th, the fledgling American Civil Liberties Union, 5 years old, they run an ad in the Chattanooga Daily Times offering to finance a test case to challenge the Butler Act. That same day, the Daily Times of Chattanooga runs a story about the ACLU planning a test case. The article says there's little likelihood that the test case proposed by a northern organization will be staged here. And the superintendent of the city schools said yesterday that the man from monkey theory had no place in the curriculum of Chattanooga's public educational institutions. The newspaper article then quoted from the ACLU press release. We are looking for a Tennessee teacher who is willing to accept our services in testing this law in the courts. Our lawyers think a friendly test case can be arranged without costing a teacher his or her job. By this test, we hope to render a real service to freedom of teaching throughout the country. The Civil Liberties Union is also making efforts against other recent restrictions on teaching. Freedom of teaching has been more interfered with by law in the past 6 months than at any time in American history. Listen to how the ACLU framed the case. It was about freedom of speech and teaching. And as you'll see, as we begin to assemble the cast of characters, that perspective, the ACLU's perspective, was not shared by all. That others, principally Clarence Darrow, saw the issue differently. And that difference mattered when decisions were made about who was going to try the case and how. In Dayton, Tennessee, a man named George Rapelier saw the ACLU ad. Who was George Rapelier? This comes from a book called The Great Monkey Trial by an author named L. Sprague de Camp. I have a personal affection for the book. It was my introduction to the Scopes Monkey Trial. So de Camp says, Rapelier was a 31-year-old New Yorker, quote, a dark, sharp-nosed, untidy, intense, argumentative, garrulous little man with poor teeth. He had grown up in a rough district of Manhattan near Times Square, where he had sold newspapers. Rapelier said that he averaged about a fight a day to maintain his favored location to sell those papers. Odd jobs took him from the city eventually to Tennessee. He marries a Tennessee girl. He takes a job as a local manager for the Cumberland Coal and Iron Company in Dayton. So by 1925, he'd been there for 3 years, which meant he was still an outsider. Chattanooga Times described him as a stranger to the South and Southern ways. And unlike most people in Dayton, Rapelier was no fundamentalist. His father was a Baptist, his mother was a Catholic, and in town, he was regarded as a visionary full of wild ideas. You can guess what one of his wild ideas was. That's right, evolution. So he moves to Dayton. He began attending a nearby Methodist church where a young modernist preacher, the Reverend Howard Byrd, persuaded him that evolution and Christianity were not incompatible. More about Reverend Byrd later. The author de Camp tells the story that Rapelier had an employee who lost a 6-year-old son in an auto accident. At the funeral, the mother was crying, "If I only knew he was with Jesus." The preacher responded to the mother, "I'll not lie to you. The boy had never been baptized. He had never confessed Christ. There can be no doubt that at this moment he is in the flames of hell." Rapelier was outraged, and he let the minister have it. Rapelier said a few days later, "I heard that the same bunch, the fundamentalists, had passed that anti-evolution law, and I made up my mind I'd show the world." Now it's Tuesday, May 5th. It's the day after the ACLU ad looking for a test case and the article in the paper. Rapelier is sitting with Frank Earl Robinson, the pharmacist who owned Robinson's Drugstore. I know some of the photos are not of the best quality. Now, of course, because Robinson owns the drugstore, he's known as Doc Robinson to his friends. Who else was Robinson? He was the chairman of the Ray County School Board. What else was Robinson? He was the town's leading textbook seller, right? So in a town like Dayton, the drugstore is a social center, so they're sitting around. Rapelier and Robinson are sitting in the back with Mr. Brady, who ran the other drugstore in town, Sue Hicks, the town's leading lawyer who had argued for the Butler law. He's there. Now, isn't that something? Sue Hicks. In 1925, Dayton's leading lawyer was a woman. Well, it wasn't something. Don't be ridiculous. Sue Hicks was a man. And there's a theory that he is the one who inspired the song A Boy Named Sue, written by Shel Silverstein, who for some reason, we are told, attended a judicial conference where Sue Hicks spoke. No detail too minute for this class. Another lawyer, Wallace Haggard, is there. His father owned the leading bank. So in Larson's second book, called Summer for the Gods, a Pulitzer Prize winner about the Scopes trial, Larson says that the most credible version of the legend is that Rapelier had run down to Robinson's drugstore with newspaper in hand, and he says, "Mr. Robinson, you and John Godsey, a local lawyer, you guys are always looking for something that will get Dayton a little publicity. I wonder if you've seen the morning paper." Rapelier had the idea. The ACLU is looking for a trial. Somebody's going to do this. Let's do it here in Dayton. People will come from all over. They'll eat in our restaurants. They'll buy rooms in our hotels. They'll buy our goods. Robinson, Doc Robinson, he kind of liked this. School Superintendent Walter White, he liked it. Larson says White liked the Butler Act, but he loved publicity for Dayton even more. Now, next step, they need somebody who had taught evolution in violation of the Butler Act. So they go to W.F. Ferguson, the principal of the high school. He was the regular biology teacher. And Ferguson says, "No, he says, I'm married. I got kids. Okay, who else can they get now that the regular biology teacher has said no? My theory is that Rapelier on the left said, let's get someone who wears the same eyeglasses that I wear. Someone says, let's ask John Scopes. Who was John Scopes? If your image of him is from Inherit the Wind, that's a stick figure. Scopes was far more interesting than that. He left us a terrific memoir called Center of the Storm that he published in 1966, 4 years before he died. Scopes was born in Paducah, Kentucky in 1900. And in that memoir, he describes Paducah as a place where business, principally the Illinois Central Railroad, brought cosmopolitan people. Quote, French and Jews, Germans fleeing Bismarck's wars, all mingled with Native American stock. There was a feeling of mutual tolerance felt by everyone but the town's Negroes, who lived in two main ghettos and fared little better than in other parts of the South and North. Age 13, Scopes and his family moved to Danville, Illinois, town of 30,000 people. He says he saw racial integration in school for the first time. They were in the Yankee North. He and his sister were the Southerners. So he tells the story that at school assemblies, everybody was seated alphabetically, except the school's two Negroes sat together in a front row, a double desk to themselves, apart from the whites. The school put Scopes and his sister up front also, directly behind the Negroes. Scopes said the school's rationale was obvious. Since Southerners discriminated against Negroes by segregating them, the school officials, being good Northerners, would punish us Southerners by seating us next to Negroes. Scopes said, those 4 seats in the stronghold of the egalitarian North taught me early in life that hypocrisy and prejudice have no Mason-Dixon line, but flourish in all locales and all seasons, and that the evils of self-righteousness in its many guises go endlessly on. 2 years later, when Scopes was 15, his family moved to Salem, Illinois, the birthplace of William Jennings Bryan. Scopes said that Bryan spoke there often, giving me an opportunity to study at leisure the man who would later inspire and assist in my prosecution. Scopes tells this story. It's a week before graduation. He and 3 friends were listening to a baccalaureate sermon by a minister. The minister had false teeth, making it hard to pronounce S. He would whistle. I can't replicate the whistling, right? So Scopes and his friends are behaving themselves until the minister quotes a verse. Come with me into the bogs and hear the croaking of the frogs. Scopes and his friends lost it. They were laughing until the last of the frogs had whistled to a halt. Everybody stares at them. The minister is embarrassed. End of story? Not so fast. The next week is the high school commencement, and the speaker is William Jennings Bryan. Bryan begins his address. Then, sure enough, in enunciating a word, he makes a pronounced whistling effect. Now Scopes and his friends lose it big time, thoroughly disrupting the spell that Bryan had cast on the audience. Scopes said, Bryan stared hard at us, and after he had his speech flowing evenly again, his eyes would dart periodically at us as if warning us to keep our silence thereafter. The incident was so unusual and possibly traumatic that, to my surprise, Bryan remembered it 6 years later when I next saw him in Dayton. Scopes started college in 1919, the University of Illinois at Urbana. He went to the University of Kentucky, transferred in the fall of 1921. He said one of his favorite teachers was the geology professor Arthur Miller, who, because he taught evolution, was of course known as Monkey Miller. How good is that? Scopes graduated from college in the spring of 1924. In the summer of 1924, he was offered a coaching and teaching job at the Central High School, the only high school in Ray County, Dayton, Tennessee. The football coach had resigned unexpectedly, so the school had no coach or anyone to teach algebra, physics, and chemistry. You got that? Algebra, physics, and chemistry. Scopes accepted, and he said coaching was the most important part of the job. Dayton, Tennessee, about 1,800 people. It's 40 miles from Chattanooga, southeastern Tennessee. It had been a mining town. The mines were closed by the time Scopes got there. There was a lot of farming. There was a trade center. It had a bunch of stores, had a couple of drugstores, including Robinson's. Scopes said he soon knew everybody in town by sight, if not by name. He was 24 years old. He was just a few years older than his students. So he knew the leading citizens in town. He had been to George Rappelier's home a couple of times. The author DeCamp says Scopes was well liked in Dayton after his year there, even if some people might have disapproved that he smoked cigarettes, danced, and even swore when things did not go well for his football team. Scopes was friendly with Sue Hicks. He sometimes double-dated with him and with Rappelier. Scopes roomed and ate with a family, the Baileys. They owned the biggest hardware store in the region. The Baileys had a son the same age as Scopes. The Bailey son and Scopes went to church together on Sundays. Scopes went to church every Sunday that year. But his own thoughts were clear. Christian fundamentalism had polluted Jesus' words. In 1922, there had been an attempt to prohibit the teaching of evolution in Kentucky, and two of Scopes's professors from the university actually fought it. In Kentucky, the opposition to the anti-evolution crowd introduced counterpart laws. A law requiring water to run uphill. A law requiring the climate and temperature to remain the same all year round. This is very impressive. I was struck. This is 38 years before Broadway theater goers heard the lyrics of Alan J. Lerner express the same thought. You know, it's true, the crown has made it clear, the climate must be perfect all the year. Camelot. Tennessee did not have such strong opposition to the anti-evolutionists. What did Scopes have to say about the evolution controversy? He said, at first, the evolution controversy, then simmering and sputtering, hardly touched my life. Coaching and teaching and attending the Saturday night dances kept me fully occupied in Dayton. Since I didn't teach biology, how could I teach evolution? He says, if I had been the regular biology teacher at the Ray County Central High School, I wouldn't have let the law restrict my teaching the truth. How could I have, considering my environmental influences? My father had read to me from Darwin's Origin of Species, Descent of Man, The Voyage of the Beagle, which I then finished reading for myself, and although not a trained scholar, I thought Darwin was right. That is the John Scopes who got summoned to Robinson's drugstore on May 5th, 1925. Robinson and the others sent a boy over to the tennis courts where Scopes was playing, saying, Mr. Robinson would like you to come to the drugstore. The story is, in his tennis clothes, Scopes walks about 3/4 of a mile to the drugstore. He tells this part of the story in his memoirs in a chapter that he entitled, of course, Getting Down to Monkey Business. What was he doing playing tennis in Dayton on May 5th? School had ended 4 days before. He had intended to go back to Paducah, Kentucky for the summer before returning to Dayton to teach in the fall. But he stayed a little longer than intended in Dayton for two reasons. First, two of his students had been injured in a car accident. And his second reason was he met a girl. So Scopes goes to Robinson's drugstore where Rapelier and the others are sitting in the back. And Rapelier says to Scopes, we've been arguing, and I said that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution. Scopes says, that's right. And he says in his memoir, he wasn't quite sure what Rapelier was leading up to. Now, the biology textbook used in Tennessee was Civic Biology by George William Hunter. This book had been used since 1909, okay, 16 years. Robinson's drugstore had supplied textbooks for Ray County. So Scopes reaches up and grabs a copy of Hunter's Civic Biology from the shelf, and he shows it to the guys at the table. Rapelier asks Scopes if he'd been teaching students this text. Scopes said that he had used it for review purposes while filling in for the principal during the principal's illness. That guy Ferguson, the principal, he was the regular biology teacher. So Scopes opens the book and he shows him the evolutionary chart and the explanation of evolution. He says, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. So Doc Robinson then says to Scopes, well, then you've been violating the law. Scopes says he didn't know technically if he'd violated the law. He knew about the Butler Act. He wasn't worried about it because he substituted for the principal when he was ill. And Scopes said, I assumed if anybody had broken the law, it was more likely to have been Ferguson. That's what Scopes wrote. What he said at the table was, well, then so has every other teacher, namely violated the Butler Act. Robinson then shows him the newspaper article and the ad placed by the ACLU offering to pay expenses for anybody who's willing to test the law. Robinson asks Scopes if he'd be willing to let his name be used for a test case. So Scopes says, well, if you can prove that I've taught evolution, that I can qualify as a defendant, then I'd be willing to stand trial. Robinson says, well, you filled in as biology teacher, didn't you? Yeah, when Ferguson was sick. Well, you taught biology then. Didn't you cover evolution? Scopes says, we reviewed for final exams as best I remember. In his memoir, he says, to tell the truth, I wasn't sure I had taught evolution. But Robinson and the others apparently were not concerned about this technicality. I had expressed my willingness to stand trial. That was enough. So Sue Hicks says to Scopes, how about it, Scopes? And Scopes says, go ahead and get your warrant. George Rapelier says, I'll swear out a warrant. That'll make a great sensation. Why not bring a lot of doctors and lawyers here? Let's get H.G. Wells and a lot of big fellows. So Robinson says to Sue Hicks, hey, you and the two Haggard brothers, Herbert and Wallace, you guys can prosecute, and lawyer John Gotze, he can defend him. This is big stuff. Rapelier then takes a piece of brown wrapping paper and he writes out a telegram to the ACLU. Professor J.T. Scopes, he wasn't a professor. Scopes had asked people in town not to call him that. Teacher of science, although of course not biology, will be arrested, charged with teaching evolution. Consent of superintendent of education for test case to be defended by you. Wire me collect if you wish to cooperate, and arrest will follow. That was the telegram from Rapelier to the ACLU. Rapelier goes off to the telegraph office. Scopes goes back to the tennis court. It's the next day, Wednesday, May 6th. Rapelier comes back to Robinson's, where the usual suspects have again assembled, and he reads this telegram from the ACLU. We will cooperate Scopes' case with financial help, legal advice, and publicity. Have you competent legal attorney? What is plan of prosecution? Has he considered federal injunction or otherwise raising federal issue under 14th Amendment? Please wire collect full particulars and state your connections. When will arrest be made? I love that telegram. These guys in New York with the ACLU are sitting there. They want to know if there's a strategy to get into federal court. One day earlier, these guys are sitting in Dayton thinking, we're going to sell a lot of hot dogs before we're finished. So the Brain Trust agrees. Scopes should respond with a telegram back to the ACLU. He writes, I will secure warrant against Scopes, who will plead guilty to teaching evolution in his class in biology during March and April. That was important. Had to be after the law went into effect. Justice of the peace will find him guilty and he will appeal. Local businessmen will go on his bond pending appeal decision of circuit court on grounds law unconstitutional, all under 14th Amendment. Have consent of Scopes, superintendent of schools, and chairman board of education. The attorney for the Board of Education has written the Secretary of State for a copy of the law, which will arrive tomorrow, Justice of Peace trial Saturday. This telegram is interesting and amusing. Rapelier is using terms he surely did not understand. He didn't really mean a trial on Saturday. The whole point in doing this was to have a huge show trial. The copy of the law which will arrive tomorrow, they didn't even have a copy of the law that they were intent on applying. Rapelier goes out to file the telegram. He comes back. Now Sue Hicks is there with the Justice of the Peace, Arthur Benson. Rapelier tells the Justice of the Peace they want a warrant for Scopes' arrest. The Justice of the Peace, Benson, pulls some blanks out of his pocket, and then he admits he didn't know how to fill one out. He had never done that. Hicks says, I'll do it. He fills it out, accusing Scopes of teaching evolution in violation of the Butler Act, and Rapelier swears to the truth of the warrant and signs it. This is getting exciting for the locals. Wallace Haggard and the Hicks brothers, these were local lawyers, with all due respect. Wills, disputes about title to property. Now they're going to litigate freedom of speech and religion. Arrest Scopes? The Justice of the Peace, Benson, he said he personally couldn't do it because he's the Justice of the Peace. The judge doesn't go arrest the defendant. He said, you need a sheriff or a deputy. And then somebody said they had just seen Deputy Swafford nearby. Who do you think offers to go out and find Deputy Swafford? That's right. Our hero, John Scopes. He goes and finds the man who's going to arrest him. And he does. Swofford gives Scopes the warrant. He tells him to appear Saturday, May 9th, before 3 justices of the peace of Ray County. I want to pause here to mention one of the sources that I'm relying on. It's very interesting. In 1959, a guy named Warren Allen was a University of Tennessee master's candidate, and he submitted a thesis entitled Backgrounds of the Scopes Trial at Dayton, Tennessee. And it's noteworthy, among other reasons, because he got to interview many of the locals who witnessed aspects of the trial. So Allen's master's thesis has become a source material for other people like Edward Larson, the author of Summer of the Gods. So now, according to Allen, we've got school superintendent Walter White. He's heading for home, and he meets up with the Reverend A.C. Stribling. Stribling is not just the pastor, he's also the local correspondent for the Chattanooga News. It's a small town, everybody has to wear more than one hat. So school superintendent White says, something has happened here that's going to put Dayton on the map, and he tells Stribling what's cooking. So now there's a phone call. We don't know if it was White or Stribling. They call the Chattanooga Times to tell them what's going on. Warren Allen says, it seemed to the conspirators that a spirit of enthusiasm was lacking at the Chattanooga Times, so they called the Nashville Banner, where the news was greeted with gusto. The Associated Press and other news services picked up the story, and 24 hours later, the whole country knew about it. Scopes goes home to his room at the Bailey's house, and he tells the Baileys about his arrest. So Bailey's son, C.E. Bailey, everybody in the town has a first name that's 2 initials, apparently. Bailey's son, who was Scopes' friend, says, you don't know what you're in for. Why, William Jennings Bryan will be here prosecuting you in 3 weeks' time. And they all laughed. Saturday, May 9th. Scopes appears before 3 justices of the peace. They bind him over to the next grand jury for indictment. The next grand jury meets the first Monday in August, and they release him. Now, after Scopes' arrest, but before the May 9th Justices of the Peace appearance, a reporter asks William Jennings Bryan if he would assist with the prosecution in Dayton. Bryan says he would help if he was wanted. So the reporters in Dayton go to the Hicks brothers, the lawyers. Would they accept Bryan's offer? The reporters are trying to make a match here, right? And the Hicks brothers say, you bet. So they prepare a wire to Bryan, but the wire never gets to Bryan. But the press knew about the intended wire, and they told Bryan, and then reported back to the Hickses. So on May 14th, the Hickses write to Bryan that they would consider it a great honor to have Bryan on the prosecution team. Dayton is sitting pretty. They've got a defendant. They've got William Jennings Bryan. What could go wrong now with this plan? What could go wrong? One word: Chattanooga. Chattanooga. Those city slickers up in Chattanooga must have been smarting that their yokel brothers and sisters down the road in Dayton had scored this public relations coup. So the Chattanooga Times sends a telegram to John Neal. He's one of the lawyers on the Scopes defense team. And Chattanooga Times proposes a change of venue to the Memorial Auditorium in Chattanooga. We got more seats. We got more of everything here. Well, apparently that didn't work, because Warren Allen reports that Chattanooga had a plan B. And plan B was a competitive arrest. A Chattanooga grand jury heard from some local students, and the name of a Chattanooga teacher was put up for a test case. Warren Allen says, oh, Dayton was dismayed. Newspapermen and wire services deserted Dayton as rats leaving a sinking ship. Dayton took action. First, they called a special session of the grand jury. They weren't going to wait for the first Monday of August. Scopes, who by this time was back in Paducah with his family, comes back to Dayton. And Warren Allen describes, this is delicious, that Scopes herded some of his students into the back of Stumpy Reed's taxi cab, and he coached them in their answers as he had never done in school. Why? They needed witnesses against Scopes. Now, some people in Dayton had formed a protest meeting against Chattanooga. They were going to tell Chattanooga that Dayton would take its business elsewhere if Chattanooga didn't leave this alone. So to draw a crowd, they decided to have Rapplier make a speech about evolution, but they wanted reporters back in Dayton. Would a mere speech do it? What could they do to attract the press? The ringleader of the protest was a guy named Bill Morgan. So Morgan gets a justice of the peace and a couple of lawyers and pays a visit to two gentlemen. They visit Thurlow Reed and Virgil Wilkie. These guys were barbers with a shop across from Robinson's drugstore. They were also musicians, played violin and guitar. They did a buck and wing dancing show. In other words, these guys were performers. They were showbiz. So Bill Morgan, the organizer of this protest, tells Virgil Reed what he wants. Virgil laughs and says, "I can't do that, but try Thurlow. Try Thurlow. I'm sorry, Virgil Wilkie. Virgil Wilkie says, try Thurlow Reed." So Bill Morgan goes to Thurlow Reed. And what he wants is that after Rapplier finishes his speech about evolution at this protest rally, Thurlow should start a fight with Rapplier. Thurlow says, "What's my cue?" Well, Rapplier had told Morgan that he'd be near the end of his speech when he says, "I'm just as certain as I am standing here today that my ancestors swung by their tails out of the grapevines." So Rapplier is speaking. Morgan is sitting next to Thurlow Reed. Rapplier says the thing about monkeys, and then he embellishes. And speaking of monkeys, there are more monkeys here in Dayton than there are in the Chattanooga Zoo. Morgan pushes Reed. He says, "Go get him." Whereupon Thurlow Reed yells out, "You can't call my ancestors monkeys," and he punches Rapplier. Now, Rapplier knew it was coming, of course. He puts Reed in a headlock, and the two of them thrash about. Apparently, these guys really sold it because others were prepared to join in the melee. Then things petered out. One of the news services reported it as a straight story about the local barber who chewed up the man who lectured on evolution. Warren Allen says that Thurlow was then famous as the man-biting barber. He actually went to court. He was fined $35. This was all for appearances. No fine was collected. And Warren Allen says, with all this noise, plus the fact that the teacher in Chattanooga had bowed out of all of that, that was that. Quote, "The spotlight swung back on Dayton. Glory seemed assured." These leaders of Dayton were promoting this seriously. Doc Robinson and another businessman prepared a 28-page booklet, Why Dayton, of all places, in an attempt to bring investors and others to Dayton. So who was going to represent Scopes? Well, John Neal was a Tennessee lawyer. He was known as a constitutional expert, and he introduced himself to Scopes by saying, "Whether you want me or not, I'm going to be here." He had been a law professor at the University of Tennessee for many years. Fundamentalists had taken issue with the selection of a certain book. They got the law professor who chose the book fired, and along with it, they fired Neal. And that may explain why Neal opened his own private law school in Knoxville. In 1924, the year before the trial, he ran for governor of Tennessee in the Democratic primary and lost to Austin Peay, who became governor, who signed off on the Butler Act. So Neal becomes a chief counsel for the defense in mid-May, at least for a brief period of time. Who was William Jennings Bryan? Well, as you've heard, he was born in Salem, Illinois, 1860. He was elected to Congress from Nebraska at the age of 30. At the age of 36, he gave what is regarded by many as the most famous speech in American political history, the Cross of Gold speech to the Democratic National Convention. That got him the nomination of that party for the president. Now, on the long list of things on which I am not expert, the Cross of Gold speech and the bimetallism issue are high. But one can make several observations from certain objective facts. First, Bryan lost the election of 1896 to William McKinley. Second, Bryan lost the bimetallism issue in 1900 when the U.S. formally adopted the gold standard. Third, Bryan lost another bid for the presidency in 1900, and he lost a third try in 1908. Fourth, after becoming Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State in 1912, he resigned in 1914 over disagreement with Wilson's policies that he believed were leading us into war. Fifth, in 1922, Bryan lost the election for moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church to a Reverend Charles Wishart, a proponent of teaching evolution at Presbyterian-run colleges and universities. Sixth, in June 1924, Bryan went to the Democratic National Convention in New York as a delegate from Florida. There had been talk of electing Bryan as a senator from Florida. He declined to run unless he was drafted, but the incumbent senator liked his job. He wasn't inclined to give it up to Bryan. That was that. Bryan addressed that convention to second the nomination of William Gibbs McAdoo, who was the preferred candidate of the South. We're told that Bryan was greeted rudely. He responded to the audience, "This is probably the last convention of my party to which I shall be a delegate." When the audience applauded, he responded, "Don't applaud, I may change my mind." You're picking up on a theme here? He was pretty much finished in politics after his tenure as Secretary of State. He was largely a speaker and a writer. Evangelical Protestant lectures were his stock in trade, 200 speeches a year, dozens of books. He moved to Florida. He invested in the land boom. It made him an overnight millionaire. Bryan is credited with helping to obtain ratification of 4 constitutional amendments. The 16th, federal income tax, the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, the 19th Amendment, that's right, women's suffrage, and the 18th Amendment, prohibition. Okay, nobody bats 1,000, particularly William Jennings Bryan. His first public address about Darwinism came in 1904. By 1921, he was speaking more widely about what he called the dangers of Darwinism. In 1922, he published a book called In His Image, where he incorporated a speech of his on the menace of Darwinism, which he called unscientific and unconvincing. Darwin's opposition to teaching evolution, in part, was based on his belief that this was an issue of democracy. The essence of democracy is found in the right of people to have what they want. If it's contended that an instructor has the right to teach anything he likes, I reply that the parents who pay the salary have a right to decide what shall be taught. What did he propose? He said, we don't ask that teachers paid by taxpayers teach the Christian religion to students, but we do insist that they shall not, under the guise of science or philosophy, teach evolution as a fact. Bryan abhorred the Ku Klux Klan, but his vision of the entirety of the populace that was to be served by his majoritarian impulse, it was a pretty limited vision. Scopes tells this story in his memoir, relayed to him by Dudley Field Malone, one of the other members of the defense team. Dudley Field Malone had worked for Bryan when Bryan was Secretary of State. So Bryan and Malone had traveled to the Holy Land, what later became Israel. Bryan was struck by the primitiveness of the area. And Bryan says to Malone, I think we need a paved road up to Mount Sinai. The U.S. could build the road with restrooms for the comfort of pilgrims. Bryan says we could have a restroom for the Protestants on the right and one for the Catholics on the left. Scopes added, I've often wondered about Bryan's plumbing plans for the Mount Sinai pilgrims. Where did he expect the Jews to go? Never mind the Muslims and all the rest. Bryan said, I was born a member of the greatest of all the races, the Caucasian race, and had mingled in my veins the blood of English, Irish, and Scotch. One has only to consider the limitations upon one's opportunities imposed by race to understand the incalculable benefit of having the way opened between the child and the stars. He was worried about students losing their religious beliefs when they headed off for college and were being taught this evolution stuff. Bryan said there's only one argument that can be made to one who rejects the authority of the Bible, namely that the Bible is true. To put him in fuller context, listen to the judgments of some of his contemporaries. Theodore Roosevelt called him an amiable, windy creature who knows almost nothing. The physicist Robert Andrews Millikan called him a pure emotionalist who could not think straight on anything. A paleontologist, William Berryman Scott, said Bryan showed invincible ignorance, found it impossible to learn anything, and could see nothing that conflicted with his opinions. Woodrow Wilson said of Bryan's ideas about money, Mr. Bryan is the most charming and lovable of men, but foolish and dangerous in his theoretical beliefs. So the author DeCamp says, you might wonder, how could such a nincompoop rise so high? The answer is he had political skills. He could chase votes, he could count votes, he could edit a paper, he could buy and sell things. Plus, his political reformism went beyond the conservatism of most fundamentalists. Bryan favored a Department of Labor, antitrust legislation, federal insurance of bank deposits. In his back and forth with Clarence Darrow about political issues, you see where they frequently made common cause. So, as you heard, Bryan ran for president 3 times. Darrow publicly supported him, and twice he campaigned for him. But Darrow tells the story that when Bryan was running for the 3rd time in 1908, Bryan asked him to campaign for him again. So Darrow said, "What do you want me to talk about?" Bryan said, "The guaranteeing of bank deposits by the government." Darrow replied that his trouble had always been getting money into the bank, not getting it out. Bryan said that he supported U.S. senators by popular vote rather than by selection by state legislatures. Darrow said as long as we had senators, it made little difference to him how they were elected. When Bryan was young, he wanted to play the piano. His father said, "Girls will play piano, boys the hand saw." Bryan said it's a very pleasant thing for a man to be able to furnish music to a company, but it is sometimes done at the expense of other lines of development. If one cannot reach the maximum in both entertainment and service, service is the more important of the two. I cannot imagine a sharper contrast of character by which to introduce Bryan's main adversary at the Scopes trial. What a monumental figure. To call Clarence Darrow a great trial lawyer does not begin to capture the man. His life and his cases could fill an entire Ollie course by themselves. Let me see if I can distill it down for you. He was born in 1857 in a town called Kinsman, Ohio. I was intrigued. Born in 1857, put it in perspective, he was 8 years old when President Lincoln was assassinated. I thought about it. I was 9 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated. I know, as I'm sure all of you remember, I know exactly where I was and how I learned about the assassination. And presumably Darrow had a similar memory of Lincoln, but if he did, he didn't think it worthy of mention in his autobiography. But I mentioned this because his temporal proximity to an assassination seems like ancient history to us, but many of us still invoke Darrow as an iconic figure in parts of contemporary struggles for social justice today. So in Darrow's biography, 1932, 7 years after the Scopes trial, he reported that his earliest known ancestor was one of 16 men who had come to New England the century before the Revolutionary War. He said his father's ancestors were rebels and traitors who took up arms against Great Britain in the Revolution. He says, "It's easy for me to believe that my father came of rebel stock. At least he was always in rebellion against religious and political creeds of the narrow and smug community in which he dwelt." What about Darrow and religion? His parents didn't hold to any of what he called orthodox religious views, but he and his siblings went to Sunday school and church on Sunday. Darrow says, "I wonder why children are taken to church. I can never forget the horror and torture of listening to an endless sermon when I was a child." He says, "Of course, I never understood a word of it, any more than did the preacher who harangued his afflicted audiences." He said his father was the village infidel. Darrow went to Allegheny College for a year. He says Latin, Greek, wasn't crazy about that. Mostly what he loved was baseball, but he did some teaching, and that led him to an interest in the law. So back in those days, it wasn't 4 years of college, 3 years of law school, and on you go. He spent 1 year in law school, then he worked in a law office in Youngstown, Ohio. He was admitted to the Ohio bar. He said he could have opened a practice in Youngstown, but it was a city of 20,000 people, and he felt awed by its size and importance. So he went back home. This guy, who became the most famous trial lawyer in America, started out as a country lawyer. Talked about the most important case he had back in Ohio, suing to recover a $15 harness for a young boy who'd received it for tending to a wealthy sick man. 4 trials, 3 appeals, 7 to 8 years. Darrow got paid $5 and said, I felt like my entire life depended on winning that case. This is how trial lawyers think. He goes to Chicago, gets a position with the city law department. Then he becomes the general attorney for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway Company. So, Clarence Darrow, the lawyer for the people, an advocate for the labor movement? That's right. Started out in-house lawyer for the railroads. And throughout his career, he would try lots of cases where he wasn't paid and also did work for very wealthy people. The railroad was different, of course, because there was an ideological issue. 1894, the railroad strikes, and he's the railroad's lawyer, and he was torn to the point that he told his employer he couldn't represent the company. He said, I realized my anomalous position. I really wanted the men to win. That had been my attitude for years. He said, I had no feeling that the members of labor unions were better than employers. I knew that, like all other men, they were often selfish and unreasonable, but I believed the distribution of wealth was grossly unjust, and I sympathized with almost all efforts to get higher wages and to improve general conditions for the masses. There's a very fine recent biography of Darrow by an author, John Farrell, called Attorney for the Damned. Farrell has a slightly less romantic view of Darrow disengaging himself from his railroad job. Farrell also describes, gives great play-by-play to some of Darrow's more famous trials. Let me give you a quick thumbnail sketch. 1894, Darrow, 37 years old, represents Patrick Prendergast, a 25-year-old newspaper delivery man with delusions who shot and killed the mayor of Chicago. He was convicted in an hour, condemned to the death penalty. Death penalty was Darrow's big thing. Darrow took the case, got a new trial, pleaded insanity, introduced experts and Prendergast's own delusional testimony, and then he argued, as he would in later cases, here is Prendergast, the product of an infinite God, not of his own making. Darrow did not succeed and Prendergast was executed. Then there was also the Pullman strike and him representing the great labor leader Eugene V. Debs. 1898, 1903, he's representing other union leaders and unions in investigations and strikes. 1907 brought his most famous trial to that time. He got an acquittal of Big Bill Haywood, a leader of the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. Haywood had been indicted as a conspirator in the murder of the former Idaho governor Frank Steunenberg. Then 1911, the case of the McNamara brothers, accused of the bombing of the Los Angeles Times building that killed 21 people and injured hundreds more. McNamara's were activist members of the Iron Workers Union. They had been in a labor war with the LA Times. You could do a whole lecture just on this case. The McNamaras pleaded guilty in the face of what seemed like incontrovertible evidence. And one of the many controversial aspects of the case is it led to the indictment of Clarence Darrow for 2 counts of jury tampering. Those counts were tried separately. The first led to an acquittal. The second led to a hung jury. But most knowledgeable commentators say the evidence was strong that Darrow actually engaged in the bribery of which he was accused. And somehow his reputation survived. One last case, well, next to last case, 1920. He represents somebody named Benjamin Gitlow, son of Russian immigrants raised on the Lower East Side. Gitlow is charged with criminal anarchy for publishing a left-wing manifesto in a radical newspaper. Listen to Darrow in his closing argument. Is anybody afraid of revolution? For a man to be afraid of revolution in America would be to be ashamed of your mother. Nothing else. Revolution, there is not a drop of honest blood in a single man that does not look back to some revolution in which he would thank his God that those who revolted won. None of you. Take the revolutions out of Great Britain, and what is left? Take them out of France and you would have the absolute despotism with the people as slaves. What of our own country? We're 150 years old or thereabouts, and we now speak about revolution as if we were speaking of cutting a man's throat, a nation born in it, born in it. If a great playwright wrote that, we would call that great writing. If it came from Aaron Sorkin, we would say, that's writing. But that was Darrow. The jury was less moved. It convicted Gitlow, who was sentenced to 3 to 5 years of hard labor. On May 21st, 1924, Nathan Leopold and Dickie Loeb, two wealthy University of Chicago students, kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old named Bobby Franks to pursue their fantasy of the perfect crime. Darrow had them plead guilty so as to focus its efforts entirely on what became a 32-day sentencing hearing before a judge. His sole interest was to spare them capital punishment. His closing argument to the judge lasted the equivalent of 2 full court days. The biographer John Farrell says that when word spread that Darrow was to begin speaking on Friday afternoon, August 22nd, 2,000 men and women showed up at the courthouse. His closing remains a tour de force in the fight against capital punishment. Here's just one expert. Darrow said, "Cold-blooded? Why? Because they planned and schemed and arranged and fixed? Yes, but here are the officers of justice, so-called, with all the power of the state, with all the influence of the press, to fan this community into a frenzy of hate, with all of that, who for months have been planning and scheming and contriving and working to take these 2 boys' lives. You may stand them on a scaffold, on a trap door, and choke them to death, but that act would be infinitely more cold-blooded, whether it was justified or not, than any act that these boys have committed or can commit. Cold-blooded. Let the state, who is so anxious to take these boys' lives, set an example in consideration, kind-heartedness, and tenderness before they call my clients cold-blooded." Darrow went on to note the influence upon Dickie Loeb of reading Nietzsche's theory of the Superman, because that's what the 2 boys believed they were. I mention Leopold and Loeb because we'll hear more about it in the Scopes trial. The judge sentenced them to life plus 99 years. 10 months later, Darrow was back in action in the Scopes monkey trial. How did he get involved? When he heard about Brian's involvement, he and his colleague, Dudley Field Malone, sent a telegram to John Neal. "We know you need no assistance, but we're volunteering." He says, "In view of the fact that scientists are so much more interested in the pursuit of knowledge that they cannot make the money that lecturers and Florida real estate agents command, in case you should need us, we're willing to work for free." It was the only time Darrow volunteered for a case. The lecturers and Florida real estate agents, he's jamming it to Brian. So Scopes wrote that the ACLU leaders in New York, they probably didn't want Darrow on the case, because the ACLU, remember, they saw this as a free speech case, and Darrow was known to be interested in it because of his perspective on religion and science. So the ACLU would have to approve Darrow because they were funding the case. The May 25th special session of the grand jury indicts Scopes. Now the trial is set, July 10th. This is just 9 weeks after Rapelier walked into Robinson's drugstore. In early June, John Neal and Scopes go to New York to meet with the ACLU. Not Darrow. The ACLU said, "We've got a lawyer, Bainbridge Colby. He's a New York lawyer. He'd been Secretary of State under Wilson after Bryan. And if it goes to the Supreme Court, we got Charles Evans Hughes, who'd already been on the Supreme Court, then ran for president, then became Harding's Secretary of State." Right? They've got eminent people. There was one problem. Scopes wanted Darrow. Bainbridge Colby, who the ACLU wanted, too dignified. And Scopes said that a newspaper man said about Colby, "He can strut sitting down." Remember that line when we talk about Inherit the Wind. So Neal and Scopes meet with various ACLU representatives. Professor Felix Frankfurter, attorneys Arthur Garfield Hayes, and Dudley Field Malone. So Malone says, "Darrow and I will do this." There's then a bitter argument against accepting their services. ACLU, Darrow's too radical. He's a headline hunter. The trial would be a circus. Well, they weren't so far off the mark on that one. Finally, somebody says to Scopes, what do you think? He says, I want Darrow. Somebody says, what if we use Malone but not Darrow? Malone says, no deal. And that's how the ACLU Executive Committee accepted the offer of Malone and Darrow. So in June, 68-year-old Clarence Darrow comes to Dayton. So did Bainbridge Colby, who then withdrew from the case. But Scopes tells this great story about Darrow. Scopes and Darrow and John Neal and Bainbridge Colby were invited to be guests for a weekend by the editor of the Knoxville News newspaper. So the editor says to them, you know, the criminal court is in session in the county that we are passing through. Would you like to observe? Darrow says yes. Scopes says the whole experience was discouraging. The poverty, the ignorance, the uncleanliness of the inhabitants of this poor county. So now they're sitting in on a rape case. And Scopes says the defendant was pathetic. He was grinning for no reason. He had no idea what was going on. Scopes said he was no match for his accuser, a girl in her late teens or early 20s. Scopes said knowledgeable beyond her years. She was pregnant. She said it was a result of the rape. Scopes said she was using this to escape her embarrassing situation. He said he was sure she didn't know which lover was responsible for her condition. And the defense lawyer is questioning her ineptly. Darrow was incensed. Darrow says, I'm going to defend that boy. And Scopes and the others said, look, you as an outsider, you could prejudice the court and the jury against him. And seeing that Darrow was about to volunteer his services, John Neal and Scopes each took one of his arms and they got him to the door and into the car, and they never learned the verdict. A few days before the trial was going to begin in Dayton, Scopes and Darrow and John Neal and Arthur Garfield Hayes, they went to Cookeville, Tennessee to argue in a federal court for an injunction to stop the Dayton trial because the Butler Act was unconstitutional. They filed their legal briefs. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they make their argument to the judge, U.S. District Court Judge John Gore. 1 hour later, Judge Gore denied their motion by reading a prepared statement. And no, I have not found anything to suggest whether there's any relationship to Al Gore. On July 7th, a wire service article reported that a clerk in Robinson's drugstore had painted in large white letters on the window pane, Judge Gore refuses to grant injunction. The article said, the news touched off a heartfelt cheer in Dayton, where townsfolk, with all their preparations made for receiving and entertaining visitors at the trial of John T. Scopes, had spent an anxious 24 hours. And Scopes said that Darrow was now pleased. He had tried to get to federal court. He had done what needed to be done for the legal strategy, but now he could get what he really wanted. Brian. July 7th, Brian arrives in Dayton. This was now known in Dayton as the monkey business. There were pins around town, you know, your old man's a monkey. And also there was a store, J.R. Darwin. J.R. Darwin had a clothing store, J.R. Darwin's Everything to Wear store. And my favorite sign of those around Dayton was this. This guy had the presence of mind to put up a sign, Darwin is right inside. With Brian's arrival, we're told the monkey signs came down, the religious posters went up, and Scopes gives us a pretty good play-by-play. The entire town turns out to greet Brian. They throw a dinner for him. The Dayton Progressive Club puts one on at the Hotel Aqua. This was the social event of all Dayton history, we're told. And Scopes was invited to go along with Neal. Darrow wasn't yet back from being out of town. The county superintendent, Walter White, the school superintendent, Scopes' accuser, called William Jennings Bryan the world's greatest man and first citizen. And White was a Republican. Remember, Bryan's a Democrat. After what Scopes called the inevitable opening prayer, Bryan said to Scopes, I think you're one of those high school students who made a disturbance at that commencement address I delivered in Salem several years ago. And Bryan laughed about it. Bryan said, no reason we shouldn't remain friends. as a politician, remain friends. Scopes said, I respected him despite our difference of opinion. And now Scopes comments on Brian's appetite. Brian's appetite was such a thing, it gets referenced in Inherit the Wind as well. So Brian had diabetes. He carried his own saccharin with him. He declined bread and sugar at dinner because he said he's on a diet. He couldn't eat sugar or starches. Scopes himself ate only a part of his own dinner. Scopes didn't touch his corn or mashed potatoes. So Brian says to Scopes, are you going to eat them? Scopes says no. So Scopes says that Brian then devoured them. He said the incident was a good tip-off to Brian's scientific knowledge. His diet prohibited sugar and starches, yet he didn't seem to realize that this included corn and potatoes, or that there was 3 times as much starch in potatoes as in the bread he had refused. At dinner, Brian makes a speech. This is an attack on the Christian religion. If evolution wins, Christianity goes. Brian's got a truck with a loudspeaker. He's going around talking about Florida real estate, while at the same time he's fighting the evolutionists. Darrow arrives in Dayton. The town throws together a similar welcoming dinner for him. And what Scopes describes is 10 minutes off the train, Clarence Darrow is making friends with people in town. He talked to the townspeople. They got to like him. Darrow told them, I was born in a small town like this. I went to school. And Darrow said, then I quit school to start my education. Darrow said, I started practicing law. For a while, I was playing poker on the side and practicing law, and I almost starved. But then I started playing poker and practicing law on the side, and I made enough money to go to Chicago and open an office. Scopes said he was a hit in Dayton. Keep that in mind when you think about and go back to watch Inherit the Wind. So Malone, Arthur Garfield Hayes, they come from New York. Malone is a dignified kind of guy, erect, well-dressed, but he was a warm personality. Arthur Garfield Hayes, he's in his 40s. Then we got Darrow, who's an agnostic. Malone was a Catholic, although divorced and remarried. Hayes had what is described as Jewish background. He was an idealist. He had a lucrative practice while also taking cases for civil liberties. And in fact, and I remember my father telling me this when I was a kid growing up, he was the lawyer of the case. He was the one making sure that the trial record included the things you'd need to include to be able to take an appeal eventually. The press was an important part of this case. There were 22 Western Union operators off in a room off to the side, reporters from numerous different countries. The radio station WGN of the Chicago Tribune covered the trial. It was the first trial broadcast on radio. They paid $1,000 a day for the telephone line. And Scopes, he kept going to church every Sunday. He said no preacher attempted to save him. He wrote that after he left Dayton, there were many such efforts, proving that the people of Dayton were a great deal more sensible than many in the world outside. The case was assigned to Judge John Ralston. Let me give you a little taste of Judge Ralston. Quote, if man without inspiration attempts to delve into the mysteries of God, he finds himself overwhelmed in perplexities. Therefore, I am much interested that the unerring hand of him who is the author of all truth and justice shall direct every official act of mine. That was the judge who was going to preside over this case. His term was expiring the next year. He was expecting serious competition. He was a Republican. In 1918, he had beat the Democrat by only 120 votes, and that was a bad year for the Democrats. He was expecting a primary challenge. Judge Ralston said in a speech in New York several months after the trial, if I lose faith in Genesis, I'm afraid I will lose faith in the rest of the Bible. And if I want to commit larceny, I'll say, I don't believe in the part of the Bible that says thou shalt not steal. Then I'll go out and steal. The same thing applies to murder. The courthouse was the tallest structure in Ray County. It had 400 seats. At the beginning of the trial, all 400 seats were taken, and we are told 300 more people were standing. What did they see? What did they hear? We'll get to all of that when we begin our observation of the trial next week. Incredibly, we have 5.5 minutes. Let me just say quickly to you, first of all, I'm thrilled that you're here, and I hope you can tell this is a labor of love for me, so to be able to share it with all of you for the next few weeks, I'm just thrilled. As we get further into this, it might be more suitable for some Q&A along the way, but there's an element of, certainly for the trial, I want you to know what went on. So that's a bit of the method to my madness. But if you are moved to ask questions, I'll do my best to take them as we go, or perhaps to try to save a few minutes at the end each day. You have my word that 9:30 means 9:30. You showed me, you take that seriously, I take it seriously for others. So we will begin promptly each week at 9:30, and you will be leaving here by 11 o'clock. Let me say also quickly about the list of resources. As I was putting the lectures together, I figured I know this crowd. It's going to be, where's that book? What was that from? And I wanted you to have the benefit of what I've been enjoying as I've put this all together. But I'm quite serious. If you don't read a word of anything, it won't matter. I've tried to design this as the talks will stand on their own, stand or fall on their own, I suppose I should say. But many of the materials are simply terrific. So it's there for you as you wish. Any questions before we depart?
Have you been to the Ray County Courthouse?
I had intended to get to the Ray County Courthouse before teaching the course, and it just didn't work. I've spoken with the head of the Historical Society, who was tremendously helpful, and also with a local lawyer in Dayton, who I was told might be of some assistance.
I was there a few years ago, and they have, it's the courthouse, the courtroom is the same.
Yes.
There's very little change to it,
Yes.
and it's still an active courtroom.
Yes.
They have, in the basement, a little museum
Yes.
dedicated to the trial. And the docent there hit us with very pro Bryant, they have a statue of him out front,
Right.
was irate at what the Northern ACLU did. And the way you explain it right now, it's more the town fathers who were bringing the trial down there than the ACLU coming into their town.
Well, of course, there were elements of both. I mean, the ACLU was looking to pick a fight, and I say that with all affection for what they did. The story about Rapelier and Robinson and all that, I mean, it could have happened elsewhere. For a brief moment in time, it might have happened in Chattanooga, but the business guys said, we know a good show when we see one, and we think we can put it on here. But the North-South thing, I'm glad you mentioned that, because on the one hand, these issues are American issues, and they're still with us today, and they're not confined to the Dayton, Tennessees of the world. On the other hand, when we get into a lot of the who said what in the trial, you'll hear there was never-ending resort to, well, the gentleman from New York, you from the big city of Chicago, and they kept hammering that. And there was great concern about whether you'll hear about it when Darrow cross-examines Bryan and how that got portrayed in the press, whether it was such a savage beating that there was damage inflicted on the cultural side of things. So it doesn't surprise me that somebody would, shall we say, reference that in the courthouse. All right, seeing no objections, court is adjourned for the day. I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.
At OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College, enjoy learning simply for the love of it. Educational partners Williams College, BCC, Bard College at Simon's Rock, and MCLA provide some of our outstanding faculty. Take a class in the arts, history, literature, and so much more. Contact OLLI today. Meet new friends. Keep your curiosity alive.